Hello, I'm Randy Heller. This presentation is to introduce the gamer to competitive play of the board game Bitter Woods, The Battle of the Bulge. It assumes the viewer is familiar with the game's rules to include optional rules and variants. I find it disappointing when a newcomer tries out a game, any game, loses to a seasoned gamer who is experienced in gameplay and never returns to the design. The purpose of this video is to address game strategy, which will allow one to compete with some skill and to even the playing field. What qualifies me to do so? I happen to be the game's designer and one of the few designers who plays his game in competition. This video will focus primarily on the 6-game turn scenario because it is the one most often selected for tournament play. Much of the game strategy discussed here also applies to the 8-game turn scenario, but not as much to the full campaign game where trading units for time and territory is not as critical or as successful. Gameplay has evolved to include the German Army artillery units for play balance, so I will include them in our discussion. You might see me referencing my notes throughout this video because I want to ensure nothing I want to share is overlooked. I will begin by showing my preferred opening move from the German 7th Army in the south and moving north to each adjoining army. From there, I will look at the American response in each army sector. Lastly, I will talk about some general strategy, such as the popular and well-known triangular defense, and present a couple of the more popular gambits. Know that there thankfully is no perfect plan. These are my recommendations, and some of the Bitter Woods veterans, also known as grognards, don't necessarily agree with all of my strategy. Let's get started. The German 7th Army seems to be the most hotly debated. Many others feel the need to build a bridge at Vianden is a high priority and will commit to a high odds attack versus 28-109. In doing so, they conveniently retreat the American unit to the road net, allowing it easy access to the center of the map on the opening game turn. In addition, this also means 9 CCA in Beaufort is left unscathed. My preference is to attack all down the river line at 1-to-1 odds, hoping for an engaged or firefight result, while at the same time keeping 28-109 from retreating onto the road. That means be careful to take no die roll modifier, also known as DRM, when making the 1-to-1 attack at Vianden. Should an A1 appear on the die roll, ensure that Brandenburger, the leader unit, calls for a stand fast so that 352-914 can maintain its zone of control, or ZOC, on hex 1130. Personally, I don't build a bridge at Vianden, not even in the campaign game. As long as I can access Esch-sur-Sûre on the 17 a.m. game turn with the 2 rocket units of the German 7th Army, I'm good. And that can be done without building a bridge. Turning to the 5th Panzer Army, the bridge in front of Clairvaux is critically important in the 6-game turn scenario. By necessity, that bridge needs to be built on the opening game turn. Here we will maximize the chance of success by taking a base 4-to-1 attack before the surprise die roll. In so doing, we have to compromise the attack versus 14th Armored Cavalry in the north in the Loschheim Gap. As an aside, note that the Germans may advance no further than the defenders' occupied hex at 28-110 due to the traffic jams rule, but that's enough to build the bridge. Let's look at the American units defending east of the Our River. We're hoping to surround, isolate, and eliminate American units. The move into hex 0918 is a given and will neutralize a regiment of the 106th U.S. Infantry Division. A D2 combat result and advance of 2 hexes will surround 106-424 and effectively neutralize that unit. Maximizing combat at the bridge in front of Clairvaux and in the center leaves only a base 2-to-1 combat versus 14th Armored Cavalry in the Lochheim Gap. In the 8-game turn scenario and campaign game, you are likely to see a greater effort here in the Lochheim Gap because, as in the actual campaign, there is a significant possibility of a generous advance after combat. Finally, we have the 6th Panzer Army sector. The combat units of the 1st SS Panzer Corps are restricted from moving on the opening game turn, but that doesn't include the Dietrich leader unit. Move it to the northwest corner in an attempt to help turn the flank on the American line. Take a 1-to-1 on Hofen and a 5-to-1 versus 99-393. Should the combination result in the capture of Hofen and an advance into Rothschild-Krinkelt, it will place the 2 regiments of the 2nd Infantry Division in an awkward position. That statistically will happen 11% of the time. We will discuss an appropriate American response to this dilemma later. That leaves enough attack force for a 2-to-1 versus 99-394. Time now to examine the American defense, again from the south to the north. As the American player, do not defend with more than 2 units in the south, and don't defend south of the Edelbruck hex row, because any unit which does so will find itself stranded and out of position. Should one of your infantry regiments become engaged on the opening game turn, such as in Echternach, don't try and rescue it, because trying a rescue can easily end up with 2 rather than 1 unit lost. Start by defending with 2 units in Edelbruck, with the 3rd retreating as quickly as possible to the center of the map board. From there, place 1 unit in Esch-sur-Sûre behind the river, with the 2nd as a backstop along the road to Martelange, so the German player, should the German player place his 7th Army mechanized unit in reserve. Don't fret if the German mechanized unit scoots along the southern map edge to block incoming American 17 p.m. reinforcements. This is a common tactic. The downside for the German player is that it eliminates the threat of this unit from going into reserve status, and it is unable to prevent 4822 and Artillery 422 U.S. units from reaching Bastogne on the American 17 p.m. game turn. They come in on the southern edge. In summary, do not overcommit American units to the defense in the south. In the 6th game turn scenario, there are 2 different approaches to defending the Clairvaux fortification. One is to utilize the Hacker Gambit. The other is to conduct a gradual retreat along the road to Bastogne with artillery serving as a backstop along the road to prevent too generous an advance after combat. I personally have had success with the Gambit and prefer to utilize it providing there are adequate units to do so. It involves placing 2, preferably full-strength units and the Middleton leader unit in Clairvaux and leaving them to defend on their own. The downside of this strategy is that it ultimately adds 3 units to the 12-unit elimination victory condition and removes the leader unit from contributing to the defense of Bastogne and Neuville. The advantage to the Gambit is that, in the least, it places a lock on German corps artillery from getting in range of Bastogne and Neuville to bombard these victory point towns on the final game turn of the scenario. The German unit in Hex 1322 is a veritable thorn in the side. There really is no alternative to placing an American unit in Heinerscheid to prevent this German unit from accessing the rear of the American defense. Hex 1218 is golden if accessible. It offers little opportunity for advance after combat, cannot be surrounded, and keeps some of the German forces on the east side of the Our River. I place artillery units at the road junctions 1520 and 1418 to provide defensive support and to prevent any German units held in reserve from breaking through. I shuttle 9 CCB over to Steinybrook, where it will provide a nearly solid defense in front of St. Vith for the remainder of the 16th. In the north, 106-422 did not start adjacent to a German unit, so it only has a movement factor of 2. Place it in Schönberg to begin a line of defense. Hex 0913 and Bellingen, or Hex 1010, continue the front line. Secure the flank in Hex 0908 and Hofen. Place artillery 402 just behind Amblev, where its range of 5 hexes will cover much of the front line. Place 14 armored cavalry behind Schönberg to prevent any generous advance after combat from trapping 9 CCB in Steinybrook. Backstop the front line with the 2nd Infantry Division to mitigate any further advance after combat. As I stated earlier, I will now reveal a defense which will allow the extrication of U.S. 2nd Infantry Division should the German player win the 11% possibility of capturing both Hofen and Rochroth-Krinkelt on the opening game turn. 99 394 and 14th Armored Cavalry may have to switch positions depending on their start locations. Use artillery 402 to add to the defense of 223 near Elsenborn, actually in front of Elsenborn. The best that can be mustered here is a 1-to-1 without a die roll modifier, 2-to-1 if using the German Army artillery variant. Have Hodges call for a stand fast on a D1. The remaining 2 regiments of the U.S. 2nd Infantry will be able to withdraw through Elsenborn and reach key defensive positions on the American 16 p.m. game turn. Let's now look at the 17 a.m. Piper breakout game turn. This is the turn that instills the most fear in the American player, as it should. The best method to minimize Piper's options is now the fairly well-known triangular defense. I cleared the map area of operations in the 6th Panzer Army sector to minimize distractions. The exact locations of German units are mostly irrelevant. We are focusing on the Kampfgruppe Piper move. Here we see the road net is well blocked, restricting the unit's movement. And in this situation, the German player is probably best served by using Piper to surround and eliminate an American unit or 2. 99 395 and 14th Armored Cavalry are clear targets. Personally, I prefer to place Piper in Hex 1513, use follow-up German units to attack 14th Armored Cavalry surrounded, and possibly use Piper with air support to attack 2-9 and advance next to Stavelot. The air interdiction unit in Hex 1208 prevents the Warsch doubled river defense from being broken. More often than not, the German player will think twice about attacking Malmedy, given the location of the Hodges leader unit and the resulting premature freeing up of the American 654 unit in Herve. We now visit a couple of the more popular gambits. The John Grant gambit has lost some of its popularity since developer Bruno Senegalio pointed out a simple counter to the ploy, but it retains its appeal for the campaign game because it provides a 1/3 chance or better of eliminating an artillery unit. The gambit begins with placing Piper in reserve on the 17 a.m. game turn. 12th SS and associated units attack the infantry unit along the road to Eupen. In our example, it's 238. And they push it back. Piper moves and attacks the artillery unit in the mechanized exploitation phase. A D4 on the defending infantry unit can legally retreat to Hex 1402, which will block any advance into Eupen itself. Bruno's simple yet clever response to the gambit is to place an air interdiction unit in the Forest Road hex behind Piper. This makes it difficult to reinforce the unit and likely commits Piper to press on toward Eupen while limiting its accessibility to other areas on the map. I spoke of the Hacker Gambit earlier. It is best used in the 6-game turn scenario and not at all in the campaign game because Middleton, the leader Middleton, is needed in Bastogne for the long haul. The Gambit involves placing Middleton and 2 full-strength combat units in the Clairvaux fortification. Here is a typical mapboard presentation when confronted by the Gambit, starting with the 17 p.m. German game turn. I can choose to begin the reduction of the Clairvaux fortification or gamble on a 4-to-1 Angriff attack, which 2/3 of the time would propel my mechanized units into the 1900 hex row. Either strategy is valid. It really comes down to how lucky do you feel? If I happen to roll a 5 or a 6 with the combat die, I feel as if I have wasted a valuable move. The advantage and disadvantage of the Gambit were addressed earlier in this video. It really should be given serious consideration. I'm going to move on in this video with some tactical recommendations and rules reminders given in short bullet format. You can investigate them via solitaire play or try any of them versus a live or online opponent. The rules for reinforcements entry are to be read and taken literally. For example, if a scheduled entry hex is occupied by a German unit or in a German zone of control, you may come in on the closest map edge hex not occupied by or in a German zone of control. If the scheduled entry hex is in a German zone of control, you may enter, but must stop. In any event, you may always delay game turn entry. Should you do so, the entry rules become more restrictive. You may now enter only on lettered road hexes on the same mapboard edge as that originally scheduled to enter. A retreat need not necessarily end up the full number of hexes away from the original defense hex. Unlike advance after combat, a retreat may exceed the retreating unit's movement factor. Be mindful of the tactic referred to as channeling a retreat. In this example, we have what's called channeling a retreat tactic taking place, in which the 28-110 is being attacked, and when called for to retreat, we generally would like to retreat towards Bastogne in a westerly direction, but the retreat rules mandate retreating to a supply road, so the 28-110 has to retreat toward Heinerscheid, onto the road toward Heinerscheid, leaving an open road for any German unit in reserve to move in the mechanized reserve movement phase through Clairvaux and on westerly. So keep in mind that tactic, channeling a retreat, is sometimes a very clever ploy to use. Rules for an advance after an Angriff are different from the usual advance after combat rules. For example, advancing units are affected by air interdiction. And if you're adjacent to a river line in an Angriff attack, and you didn't start adjacent to that river line, you may not cross in your advance after the Angriff. So be aware of that. Also, when mud starts on the turn record chart, be cognizant of what happens with mud. In one game, I once thought I could make a reserve movement into Trois Ponts until I realized the advent of mud no longer allowed hex 1914 to be treated as a clear terrain hex, and my mechanized units had to stop in their advance in hex 1914. Leader units may be selected as a step loss and count toward unit elimination for victory points. Any mechanized unit can be placed in reserve, but only a leader unit may release that unit from reserve. Should a leader unit be eliminated, all associated units belonging to the leader's army in reserve have their reserve status removed. Army boundaries have specific start and end points as designated on the map. Theoretically, one could move units from the 1st SS Panzer Corps all the way to the southeast map edge, but it would serve no purpose. Once past a designated Army boundary, the mechanized unit which moved past its boundary is free to move anywhere. The supply shortage table can be deceptive. One could not assign a mechanized division to the German 7th Army to avoid fuel depletion. Take, for example, the 2nd SS Panzer Division. Should it be assigned to the 5th Panzer Army, it would still be susceptible to being out of supply should the Francorchamps fuel dump not have been captured by the Germans. An army unit which could not otherwise cross a blown river bridge hexside can do so versus an undefended position by declaring bridge building and moving across at the end of the game turn. To realize a flanking attack bonus or coordinated defense bonus requires every unit of the 3 units to possess an unmodified endurance rating or ER of 5 or better. Take, for example, the 9th SS Panzer Division, where only 1 regiment of the division has an ER of 5. That division could not realize that particular die roll modifier. Sometimes capturing a victory point town first requires a successful bombardment, so anticipate that and keep your car artillery moving forward. The Skorzeny sneak involves only a one-time die roll. In other words, moving through just one zone of control is all that is possible. Anticipating the possible sneak is often difficult for the American player due to unit shortage on the map. Sometimes one has to count on your luck to hold out. If Skorzeny is successful, it isn't necessarily a definitive game changer. Only 1 SS Panzer scare is allowed per individual combat. However, the Piper variant allows a unit to be broken down into components which may provide a 3rd scare die roll in a single game turn. The 18 AM random events definitely add some excitement to gameplay. Operation Bodenplatte can be a two-edged sword. Whomever it helps the most is dependent upon the current mapboard situation. Do note that this random event does not remove air interdiction that has already been placed on the mapboard. The Von der Heydt parachute drop can be a windfall for the German player. Choose your drop zone carefully because a single company unit can not only affect American unit movement, but can cancel the ability of an American artillery unit from firing as well. This would occur should the Von der Heydt company fall directly on top of an American artillery unit or fall and land successfully next to that American artillery unit. If the American player finds himself in desperate straits waiting upon the arrival of reinforcements, know that air interdiction can potentially shut down an entire road net. Just be careful not to place air interdiction in a forest road hex because German mechanized units can challenge the air interdiction in these hexes. I will briefly comment on my perceptions of campaign gameplay. As a German player, I expectedly focus on the capture of Bastogne. Once accomplished, I create a defensive position on the eastern side of the Ourthe River and turn my attention to capturing Marche in the center. With the 6th Panzer Army, my focus is on Liège. I typically devote 2 panzer divisions to the capture of Eupen and the territory beyond Eupen, where I can gain combined arms shifts in clear terrain. If I find I'm not making strong enough territorial gains, I will focus on unit kills to gain a victory shift level. For the American player, it's a bit more complicated. The German player has to maintain his initial momentum via unit kills to keep the Americans off balance. Once you have stabilized the front line, the initiative will change over to the American side. There is no formula for knowing when to give up territory rather than sacrificing units. That knowledge is gained through gameplay experience. It goes without saying that you need to build a fortification in Bastogne and Marche to delay the Germans. More often than not, I delay the Patton forces a game turn and enter them into play to the west of the Germans. One tactic I strongly emphasize is to build an IP in Herstal. It will prevent the German player from gaining an ER die roll modifier and combined arm shift on this very important defensive position. I will wrap this up by answering the following question. How does the Allied player judge how well he is doing during a campaign game? Bastogne will ultimately fall to the Germans should your German opponent devote adequate force and time to its reduction. However, retaining Marsch as a fortified defense position is often a weather vane regarding your performance. If you can consistently maintain a coordinated defense with 2 regiments forward and 1 directly behind for a die roll modifier, you likely have the upper hand. Another marker is the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, which arrives in the 20 a.m. game turn. If the American player can maintain divisional integrity with that division, rather than dividing it up into its components and sending them in as a fire brigade, he is doing well. This concludes the video, which I hope you found helpful. Try out some of these recommended tactics and see how they work out for you. Should you have questions or would like elaboration, I remain available on the Consim World and Facebook Bitterwood pages. Enjoy the game and thank you for listening.